Hello everyone, Woshkona here, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about one of the most exciting part of the history that I remember from the history class, and I think first of all I paid attention to that specific person mainly because his name was sounding ridiculous when he would say this in Russian, but otherwise it's just two men with the same name, shared the same principles, and they actually turned out to make a history that made it to the history books. And yes, we're talking about Hussite Wars and about Jan Zizka and Jan Hus. So I think I've, since my school years, really remembered Jan Zizka as this badass, first one-eyed general. After this, he actually lost his second eye during the Hussite Wars, and that all resulted in him still being the hetman, which actually sounds the same as in Ukrainian, being a leader of the army of Hussites, the dudes who were opposing the Catholic Church. And this whole movement was called after Jan Hus, and I think I'm really steering things up a little bit, so I guess this whole history would more require a better explanation. Because I initially wanted to just record some thoughts about Jan Zizka and his crazy endeavor in terms of how he became one of the greatest general of his age. But let's start from the man himself, Jan Hus, because if it wouldn't be for him, probably Jan Zizka wouldn't have become such a prominent name in a wider history, wider than just Bohemia and or Czech Republic, Czechia, Czech. I think they changed the name to Czechia recently in terms of English, so that's at least easier to pronounce for me. So Jan Hus, who's that? Jan Hus pretty much was one of the first reformists of Catholic Church. He pretty much was really in favor of John Wycliffe message that he, like his philosophical thoughts about how the Catholic Church and the Church itself should be actually working. That if you remember from the history lessons, if you probably studied in Europe, or I'm not sure whether people in America or other parts of the world really thoroughly studied the medieval times, but Catholic Church was extremely powerful and rich. It was so influential to the point that kings had to really cooperate with church in order to seize the power in their own countries. And Pope was definitely one of the most influential people in the whole Europe. The thing is that church was becoming richer and richer, bigger and bigger. They were using the same dogma, and clearly it's been a well-running operation. So at some point of time, besides all the riches that they've been collecting from the wealthy of the world who wanted to get indulgence for their sins, as well as church became kind of an elitarian club that not really all the people, like a real proper peasants who are also Christians, couldn't really get the wine and bread as it's supposed to be by the ritual in the church. And that's really something that first of all, John Wycliffe started to criticize, and then something that Jan Hus took even further upon himself, and as him being a bishop and priest, plus he has been teaching theology in the main university in Prague, which was Karl's university, in the whole Bohemia pretty much was one of the main establishments, and as you can tell, we're talking about beginning of 15th century, so it's quite an old university, and there hasn't been that many universities back in the days. So he started his beef with Catholic Church for quite a long time, and besides that, as any huge syndicate, as Catholic Church has been at that time, they also were trying to fight for power within the church. So back in the time, there were actually two popes. One that was residing in France, and the other one was residing in Rome. So what happened is that these two popes, they were both considering themselves to be super legitimate and right, and they were dividing their influence around all the European countries. And as Bohemia was at that point of time still sort of independent, and the king Wenceslas IV, I believe, he wanted to, he didn't really want to go under the influence of any of the popes, and seeing that he wanted to make a powerful statement, thus he supported an anti-pope, Alexander V, who pretty much was put to the power of being anti-pope, which is like a pope in opposition to the other popes, kinda. So he was kind of brought to this power by the Bohemia. And actually, initially he was considered to side with Czech at that point of time, initially with Jan Hus as well, because he has already been quite influential and he's been quite popular by Wenceslas. And of course, he has been super popular among people because clearly most of the people in the whole country are just poor peasants. And they, of course, would follow those who really are trying to help them out and look out for themselves. So at that point of time, Jan Hus became quite a prominent figure in Bohemia. However, his all teachings were still considered to be a heresy, because his main things that he's been criticizing, that church and Pope becoming too powerful, and he doesn't like that. This is not what the Bible taught the people and how it's supposed to be. All the riches of church should be given away, they should get rid of, because all the real priests and all the religion workers, they should be really living ascetic life, rather than collecting the riches from everyone and showing, because in this ways they're not really servants of the God on earth, but more like really weird representatives who are trying to run the business wheel as much as possible, which was technically true. They were clearly exploiting the faith of people by just becoming much more powerful and wealthy. However, all the beliefs in the Alexander V, who was the anti-pope at that point of time, didn't really prove true, because he also didn't like Jan Hus, as clearly when you're trying to become anti-pope and you're in an open opposition to what popes who are legitimately in power are, you're also doing this not just to be good and with people and stuff. You're most likely still willing to seize the power, become the pope yourself, and be the one who's getting all the cookies. So at the end of the day, Jan Hus was kind of doomed, and his ideas, which were considered to be a heresy, and that his belief that the ideas first said by John Wycliffe should be spread, and that he translated his work into Czech, and despite all that, he still wasn't put in prison yet. He had to go into exile, which was already quite a big thing. He's been in exile for 2 years after another anti-pope who came to power after Alexander V, John 23rd. They're really not creative with names, what can I say? And then, at that point of time, once he was in exile, he was going around Czech, the Bohemia, and basically preaching and explaining everyone, and he sort of was converting everyone to Hussites, to being Hussists. Yes, Hussites. It's a bit weird to say it in English. So his Hussist movement of Christianity was one of the most popular movements in the whole Bohemia. Pretty much at some point of time, historians saying that about 90%, 80, at least the minimum they were given was 80% of people who were actually regard themselves as Hussites, because clearly another part of that was that Bohemia wasn't only Czech people living in there, but also some Poles and Germans, so they were much more leaning towards the classic Catholic preachings. So what happened after all this? Jan Hus was again called out, and he was going to the council in Constance, which became quite a faithful event for him, because basically it was sort of a trial. So he was called out for a debate with his other opponent, who was sort of prepared his arguments against Jan Hus to again prove that all his teachings are real heresy, and that all he's saying is not true, and the church is good and Hus is wrong. And despite being under the protection of Wenceslas IV, or Sigismund, one of the rulers of Bohemia pretty much, when he arrived to Constance, which was, I think, the German territory, he was unfortunately losing his safety and his safeguard provided by the Bohemian king. So what happened at the end of the day, after a trial, which clearly all his beliefs and the things, they asked him to renounce from all the things he'd been preaching, which he refused to do, because he's saying that if you can find anything that I was saying was not in Bible, and if Bible is the only thing that can prove my saying wrong, and my only judge can be a Christ, they just got him captive for 76 days, and he got sick, he was barely fed, and he was sitting in a tower in Constance, waiting pretty much for his execution. As it turned out to be, he, after sitting for quite a while in Constance, in June, or at the beginning of June, he got executed. At the place of the execution, the Hus knelt down, he preached out loud, then he was undressed and tied with a rope to a stake, where pretty much he was supposed to be burnt on a stake. And it was the very last moment. The executioner, he asked if he's ready, if he was willing to recant, and thus in this way he would still be able to save his life. Hus, of course, declined to do this, and he stated, "God is my witness that the things charged against me I never preached. In the same truth of gospel which I have written, taught, and preached, drawing upon the sayings and positions of the holy doctors, I am ready to die today." Which is quite a position that he kept until very last minutes of his life. And I guess people like Jan Hus are the ones who are really changing the course of history. So basically there is also an anecdote that there were some troubles for executioner, that he couldn't really intensify the fire for the stake on which Jan Hus was supposed to get burned, to burn alive pretty much. Yeah. So there was an old lady who just decided to help out the executioner and brought a little bit of brushwood in order to fire, to help intensifying that. And to this, Hus just exclaimed, "O sancta simplicitas," which in Latin means like the saint simplicity, something like this, which became like a phrase, quite a common phrase that people know up to these days. And besides that, he also cried out that Christ, Son of the living God, have mercy on us, which is a variant of the Jesus prayer, according to what I see here. And after this, his ashes were thrown into Rhine, and basically, so his remains will just disappear forever, and will never be able to. None of the Hussites will be able to. So yeah, that was the end of Jan Hus, but not the end of his ideas, of his preaching, of his way on how to reform the Catholic Church and how to make it much more accessible to the actual believers, to the regular, common simpletons and normal people who are like 90% of the whole population of any single country. And that inspired to start Hussite Wars. And the name pretty much is drawn from Jan Hus, and Hussites are his followers. And of course, what happened is that the Pope wasn't really happy with Bohemia, predominantly, being sort of, were so rebellious, and they really didn't want to continue being Catholic, and they wanted to preach the way that Jan Hus taught them. So the Pope called a crusade. Yet another thing that Jan Hus was superly against of, because he was believing and saying that crusades have nothing to do with the real faith, and this is not the way that we should be spreading the Christianity and trying to protect ourselves from all the possible threats. But anyhow, the crusade was called, and the leader of Hussites at that point of time was already the man I already mentioned at the very beginning, Jan Zizka, the legendary hetman who has been fighting for almost all of his life. He actually been coming from quite a relatively wealthy family. They had their own estate, however, they were having some troubles, monetary troubles, that usually happens with people from that class. And apparently there was some debacle that Jan Zizka at some point of time became an infamous bandit, leader of bandits in Bohemia, where he was even fighting with some castles, sieging them. So he was quite talented at war and the war mastery and how to command and lead people. And he's been also taking part in a lot of famous and important battles, for example, like Battle of Grunwald. He was fighting there, I believe, on the Polish and Lithuanian side against the Teuton Order of Germany, Prussia. Yeah, Germany didn't really exist at the point in time. Holy Roman Empire, I believe, that's what it was called. But anyhow, so Jan Zizka was extremely talented and wonderful leader of Hussites, and basically all the crusades, there were 5 crusades, 3 of which the Hussites were still under command Jan Zizka, who during, I believe, the first crusade lost his second eye, and fully blind he was still successfully commanding the army, and there was none of the crusades that were taken against the Hussites who were successful. So basically he didn't have a real army, but he was really a resourceful man. He had to teach all the peasants to face the actually extremely trained and experienced warriors and knights from those people who were partaking in the crusades, and he succeeded. So as he was resourceful, as I already mentioned, he shown and did some training for all the peasants and explained how they should be using all the weaponry that they had available, and they were also reusing all the tools that are usually used for agriculture in order to make them usable for battles as well. For example, they were using carts extremely well, and pretty much they were using them as mobile fortifications, so they would hide behind them. They would use muskets or even small cannons in order to fight against the clearly much more properly equipped army in this particular case. It was that they were facing, and they were pretty much really succeeding in that, because he was really the first European commander who pretty much started to maneuver with small cannons that they mounted on these carts and wagons, and they were really using them at all times. So he knew exactly what he was doing. For example, if they would hide behind the carts, they knew that when knights would be charging, even when they mounted, they still would stand no chance. Besides that, muskets are clearly just one-shot weapon, so of course they had time to recharge. But because they were protected, they were able to really withstand all the forces that was rushing at them. And same was happening when they would first defend themselves behind the castle walls as well. So pretty much his tactics were that first they defend and then they counterattack. So first they would sort of embrace the fatigue in their enemies, and after this they will be able to successfully counterattack and just kill them. And this pretty much worked in all the battles that he did, and he knew in which way the Germans would be attacking and the way they were working. Same goes for Polish, who were also against Hussites at that point of time. That he knew how they attack, how they defend, what are the weak spots, and he just exploited all his knowledge, which is admirable. That at some point of time he even did it all blinded, fully blind, and he taught well the person who was his successor, Prokop the Great, who pretty much continued on leading Hussites to win the other two crusades, which all ended up in signing the Basel Agreement, peace treaty, sort of, after which Bohemia was given the right to preach whichever version of Catholicism they prefer. And clearly at that point of time they were preferring the Hussism, and this pretty much became the end of Hussite Wars, and Bohemia was like one of the first adopters of one of the versions of Protestantism, something that Martin Luther popularized already 100 years after Jan Hus initially proposed it to everyone. And the way that Lutheranism spread it and changed a lot of things in Europe is probably the thing for another story. Well, I hope you enjoyed this little historical excursion into the past, into one of my, for some reason, vivid memories from the history lessons of school years about Jan Hus and Jan Zizka and how they change Catholicism and the war art. Thank you for listening. Bye.